The night was heavy with rain, neon lights flickering as Jack Miller walked into the crowded street, his heart pounding with the echo of failure. Jack Miller said, "They called me a dropout, a fool chasing empty dreams." His voice cracked, drowned by thunder. Sarah Lopez followed closely, her umbrella barely shielding her, whispering, "Jack, please, don't let this destroy you." Jack Miller said, "I've already lost everything. My savings, my reputation, even my friends." The city's noise blurred into a cruel chorus mocking his desperation. Michael Carter appeared in his memory, smiling coldly during the last board meeting, his betrayal burning deeper than the storm. Jack Miller said, "He took everything we built and handed it to Daniel Reed." His anger cut sharper than the rain. Robert Hayes had once warned him, "Trust is currency, Jack, spend it wisely." But wisdom came too late. Jack Miller clenched his fists as headlights flashed, revealing his drenched silhouette against the chaos. Emma Johnson's words echoed, "You should have finished college, Jack. None of this would have happened." His breath grew heavy, mixing with the city's fumes. Jack Miller said, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I was never meant for this." The storm howled louder, as if daring him to surrender. Yet a fire smoldered inside him. Jack Miller whispered, "But I won't quit, not tonight, not ever." Morning light broke through Jack Miller's tiny apartment window, cluttered with overdue bills and broken promises. Jack Miller said, "How many times can I fail before it destroys me?" Sarah Lopez brewed coffee, her voice gentle. "Jack, failure isn't final." Jack Miller said, "Feels like it is when the world keeps laughing." Emma Johnson's voicemail echoed, "Come home, Jack. Stop embarrassing yourself." His hands shook as he scrolled through rejection emails, each one stabbing deeper. Robert Hayes had once said, "Resilience isn't built in comfort, Jack. It's forged in fire." Jack Miller whispered, "Then this fire is burning me alive." Later that day, Jack Miller walked past towering corporate buildings, their glass walls mocking his insignificance. Jack Miller said, "All this power, and I can't even pay rent." Daniel Reed's name flashed across a news ticker. "CEO dominates market again." Jack Miller muttered, "He wins because Michael betrayed me." Passers-by ignored him, their umbrellas like shields from his existence. Sarah Lopez said, "Jack, you'll have your moment, but you need to fight smarter." Jack Miller looked at her, drenched in doubt, whispering, "What if I never win?" That night, Jack Miller lay awake, staring at cracked ceiling plaster. Jack Miller said, "I traded my future for a dream that betrayed me." Emma Johnson's voice filled his memory. "A degree would have saved you." Jack Miller clenched his jaw, whispering, "A degree wouldn't save my soul." Sarah Lopez, sitting on floor beside bed, whispered, "I believe in you even if you don't." Silence pressed heavy, broken only by rain against the window. Jack Miller said, "Belief isn't enough. I need a plan." The next morning, Jack Miller stood before a mirror, his reflection fractured by a crack. Jack Miller said, "You're either the man who quits or the man who fights." His breath fogged the glass. Robert Hayes' words echoed, "Your scars are proof you're still alive." Jack Miller clenched his jaw, whispering, "Then I'll make these scars my armor." Sarah Lopez knocked on door, voice steady, "Jack, the world isn't ready for you, but maybe it needs you." He exhaled, gripping the sink tighter, fire slowly replacing doubt. Jack Miller sat in a crowded cafe, laptop open but untouched, his eyes scanning news headlines about Daniel Reed's empire. Jack Miller said, "He's untouchable, Sarah." Sarah Lopez leaned closer, whispering, "No one is untouchable." Jack Miller said, "He controls everything. He even owns Michael now." Sarah Lopez answered softly, "You still have your vision, Jack." Robert Hayes' voice echoed in memory, "Ideas aren't enough without execution." Jack Miller said, "Execution requires money, and money requires trust." Olivia Price entered, heels striking floor, her presence magnetic. Olivia Price said, "If you want backing, you need to convince me first." Jack Miller stared, his heart racing with hope and fear. Later that evening, Jack Miller pitched nervously across a polished table. Olivia Price tapped her pen unimpressed. Jack Miller said, "This isn't just a product. It's a movement." Olivia Price raised an eyebrow. "Movements collapse without leaders." Jack Miller said, "Then I'll lead." Olivia Price leaned back, crossing arms. "Your track record says otherwise." Sarah Lopez interjected, "Jack has failed, but failure built his fire." Olivia Price's eyes softened for a moment, then hardened again. Olivia Price said, "Prove it to me. Show me why I should risk everything." Jack Miller whispered, "Because I have nothing left to lose." The next day, Jack Miller stood in front of an abandoned warehouse, his dream location for a startup office. Jack Miller said, "This place is broken just like me." Sarah Lopez smiled faintly, "Then we'll rebuild it." Jack Miller kicked rusted door, whispering, "No one believes we can." Sarah Lopez replied, "Then we'll make them believe." Tom Wilson appeared from shadows, toolbox in hand, quiet but ready. Tom Wilson said, "Tell me where to start." Jack Miller's chest swelled, realizing loyalty still existed. Jack Miller said, "We start by turning ruins into our foundation." Inside the warehouse, broken beams and cracked concrete surrounded them. Jack Miller wiped dust from his forehead, whispering, "Feels impossible." Sarah Lopez said, "Every empire begins in ruins." Tom Wilson worked silently, hammering nails with steady rhythm. Jack Miller said, "Michael Carter laughed when I suggested this dream." Sarah Lopez said, "He doesn't matter anymore." Jack Miller crouched, running fingers across the concrete floor. Jack Miller said, "This floor will hold a company that changes everything." Sarah Lopez smiled, "And when they laugh again, we'll already be winning." That night, Jack Miller and Sarah Lopez sat on the warehouse floor, laptops glowing faintly in the darkness. Jack Miller said, "Do you think we're crazy?" Sarah Lopez laughed softly, completely. Jack Miller smirked, "Then we're in good company." Tom Wilson tightened final bolts nearby, silent but steady. Emma Johnson's voicemail replayed on Jack's phone. "Come home before you destroy yourself." Jack Miller ignored it, saying, "I'm already home." Sarah Lopez placed her hand on his, whispering, "Then let's build something worth bleeding for." The warehouse creaked, but hope echoed louder. Jack Miller stared at the cracked screen of his phone. Another rejection email glowing red. Jack Miller said, "They won't even hear me out." Sarah Lopez replied, "Then we'll make them listen." Jack Miller muttered, "Daniel Reed controls the stage, not us." Tom Wilson hammered in silence, frustration flickering in his eyes. Jack Miller said, "Every door I knock on slams shut harder." Sarah Lopez answered, "That means we're knocking on the right ones." Jack Miller clenched his jaw, whispering, "Michael Carter stole my trust. Daniel Reed stole my credibility." Sarah Lopez said, "No one can steal your will, Jack." He slammed laptop closed, exhaling, "Then I'll force them to notice me." That evening, Jack Miller stormed into a networking event filled with polished executives. "I'm Tuel, I'm Ding." Jack Miller whispered, "This is enemy territory." Sarah Lopez adjusted her blazer nervously, whispering, "Then let's fight with words." Daniel Reed stood across the room, towering in tailored suit, laughing with investors. Jack Miller clenched fists, muttering, "He thrives on crushing people like me." Olivia Price walked to him, sharp smile cutting tension. Olivia Price said, "Jack, this is where wars are won, without shouting." Jack Miller inhaled, forcing his voice steady, "Then watch me rewrite the rules." Jack Miller stood before investors, voice trembling but fierce. Jack Miller said, "You bet on giants because they're safe, but giants fall." Daniel Reed smirked in the shadows, sipping wine. Olivia Price crossed her arms, watching him carefully. Jack Miller said, "I'm not selling a product. I'm selling resilience." The room buzzed, some laughing, others intrigued. Sarah Lopez whispered to herself, "Come on, Jack, don't break now." Jack Miller leaned forward, voice cracking, "If I fail loudly, but if I win, I change everything." Silence followed, then scattered claps broke tension. Later that night outside the ballroom, Jack Miller collapsed on steps, sweat dripping from his forehead. Jack Miller said, "I gave them everything. Was it enough?" Sarah Lopez sat beside him, whispering, "You shook them, Jack. That's a start." Olivia Price stepped outside, heels clicking. Olivia Price said, "You've got heart, but heart doesn't sign contracts." Jack Miller said, "Heart builds revolutions." Olivia Price smirked, "Then prove it with results." She walked away into the night, leaving Jack trembling between hope and despair. Sarah Lopez squeezed his hand, whispering, "We'll prove it together." Back in the warehouse, silence weighed heavier than the broken beams. Jack Miller whispered. They applauded, but no one signed. Tom Wilson worked quietly, tightening bolts without a word. Sarah Lopez said, "It takes more than one night to build an empire." Jack Miller said, "It only takes one night to break me." Sarah Lopez touched his shoulder. "Then don't let tonight be that night." Jack Miller stared at the dim laptop screen. Rejection emails piled higher. Jack Miller whispered, "If they won't give me a stage, I'll build my own." Jack Miller entered the warehouse late at night, heart pounding as he noticed documents scattered across the desk. Jack Miller said, "This isn't mine." Sarah Lopez frowned, whispering, "Who's been here?" Tom Wilson emerged from shadows, toolbox in hand. "No one but us, Jack." Jack Miller picked up a folder, his hands trembling. Jack Miller whispered, "Contracts with Daniel Reed?" Sarah Lopez gasped, "This can't be real." Jack Miller's eyes narrowed, muttering, "Michael Carter. He's still tied to Reed." Jack Miller slammed the papers down, shouting, "He betrayed us from the start." Sarah Lopez touched his arm, whispering, "Then we finally know our enemy." The next day, Jack Miller stormed into a sleek corporate office, Michael Carter waiting behind glass walls. Jack Miller growled, "You sold me out." Michael Carter smirked, "Business isn't about friendship, Jack. Jack Miller slammed fists on the table. "You were my partner." Michael Carter leaned forward, eyes cold. "I was your exit plan." Sarah Lopez said, "You chose greed over loyalty." Michael Carter stood, straightening his tie. "I chose survival." Jack Miller said, "You chose chains, Michael. Daniel Reed owns you now." Michael Carter chuckled, "Better owned and powerful than free and broke." Jack Miller whispered, "We'll see about that." That evening, Jack Miller sat broken on warehouse floor, hands covering his face. Jack Miller whispered, "Everything I built was a lie." Sarah Lopez knelt beside him. "No, Jack, the dream is still yours." Jack Miller shouted, "Michael Carter poisoned it." Tom Wilson paused his work, looking uneasy. Jack Miller said, "Daniel Reed will crush us before we even start." Sarah Lopez grabbed his hands, saying, "Then fight smarter. Don't fight like him." Jack Miller's breathing slowed, anger melting into resolve. Jack Miller whispered, "If he wants war, I'll give him one." Sarah Lopez nodded, "Then let's prepare for battle." Jack Miller stood on a rooftop, city lights blazing beneath him. Jack Miller said, "He thinks betrayal broke me." Robert Hayes joined him quietly, saying, "Betrayal is fuel if you use it right." Jack Miller said, "I trusted Michael Carter more than anyone." Robert Hayes said, "Then let that pain sharpen you." Jack Miller whispered, "Daniel Reed and Michael Carter think they've won." Robert Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, "Then prove them wrong." Jack Miller stared at skyline, voice firm, "I'll build something they can't touch." Robert Hayes said, "Now you are thinking like a leader." Back at the warehouse, Jack Miller addressed Sarah Lopez and Tom Wilson with newfound fire. Jack Miller said, "Michael Carter chose his side, now we choose ours." Sarah Lopez replied, "We fight until there's nothing left." Tom Wilson added softly, "I'll follow wherever you lead." Jack Miller paced, fists clenched, "Daniel Reed and Michael Carter don't see me as a threat. That's their mistake." Sarah Lopez said, "Then let's make them regret underestimating you." Jack Miller whispered, "From this moment we stop surviving. We start building." The warehouse echoed with a new kind of hope, one born from betrayal. Jack Miller stood in the warehouse, walls newly painted, tables lined with laptops buzzing. Jack Miller said, "This is it. Our fight begins here." Sarah Lopez answered, "Then let's show them we're more than survivors." Tom Wilson tightened cables, silent determination on his face. Jack Miller whispered, "Every scar, every failure, it brought us here." Emma Johnson's voice echoed from a phone call. "Jack, don't destroy yourself chasing ghosts." Jack Miller muttered, "I'm not chasing ghosts, I'm creating fire." Robert Hayes walked in, eyes glowing with pride. "Now, you look like a leader." Jack Miller said, "Then let's lead this war." At a bustling investor summit, Jack Miller stepped onto the stage, heart racing. Jack Miller said, "I'm not here to beg, I'm here to declare." The audience stirred. Olivia Price watched sharply from the front row. Daniel Reed smirked, arms folded in the back. Jack Miller said, "I built this with nothing but pain, persistence, and vision." Sarah Lopez whispered from backstage, "He's not trembling this time." Jack Miller raised his voice, "Daniel Reed controls money, but I control belief." Gasps filled the hall. Olivia Price leaned forward, intrigued. Daniel Reed's jaw tightened. Jack Miller whispered, "And belief builds empires." After the speech, investors buzzed with chatter. Jack Miller said, "Some will laugh, but some will listen." Sarah Lopez smiled, whispering, "I saw their eyes light up." Olivia Price approached, saying, "You shook the room, Jack, but shaking isn't sealing." Jack Miller said, "Give me one chance, and I'll turn shaking into groundbreaking." Daniel Reed stormed past, muttering, "You'll be dust before sunrise." Jack Miller smirked, "Or the storm that buries you." Olivia Price paused, impressed by his fire. "Then let's see if your storm holds." Sarah Lopez whispered, "We're closer than ever." Jack Miller nodded, and there's no turning back. Later that night, Jack Miller sat in the warehouse surrounded by glowing monitors, plans pinned on walls. Jack Miller said, "This is our battlefield." Tom Wilson adjusted blueprints, nodding silently. Sarah Lopez leaned over table, "We've come too far to stumble now." Robert Hayes added, "This is the crucible. Survive this, and you'll never fear again." Jack Miller said, "Daniel Reed thinks money is armor. He doesn't know persistence is a weapon." Sarah Lopez whispered, "Then let's sharpen it tonight." Jack Miller said, "We're building more than a company. We're building a revolution." The warehouse pulsed with new life. At dawn, Jack Miller stood outside the warehouse as sunlight spilled across cracked streets. Jack Miller whispered, "This is the day everything changes." Sarah Lopez stepped beside him, smiling, "And the day we stop being ignored." Tom Wilson carried crates inside, silent but steady. Robert Hayes said, "Your enemies will come harder now." Jack Miller replied, "Let them. Every scar made me stronger." Sarah Lopez whispered, "Jack, you're no longer the dropout. You're the storm." Jack Miller clenched fists, eyes blazing. "Then let's unleash it." The morning light bathed them, signaling the true beginning of their fight. The warehouse buzzed with energy as orders came in for the first time. Jack Miller said, "We're alive." Sarah Lopez leaned against a desk, whispering, "We're more than alive, we're thriving." Tom Wilson smiled faintly, tightening bolts as servers hummed. Robert Hayes entered, nodding, "You took your pain and forged it into strength." Jack Miller whispered, "And now the world sees us." Emma Johnson called on speakerphone, her voice shaky, "Jack, I was wrong. You built something real." Jack Miller said, "I didn't do it alone." Sarah Lopez smiled proudly, "But you led us here." At a cafe downtown, Jack Miller sat across from Olivia Price. Jack Miller said, "We're no longer begging, we're choosing our partners." Olivia Price smiled faintly. "I like this version of you." Jack Miller said, "One who doesn't fear falling." Olivia Price leaned forward, "Investors are circling. They'll test you harder now." Jack Miller whispered, "Let them. I welcome the storm." Olivia Price smirked. "Then maybe I'll stand in your corner after all." Jack Miller said, "Not for me, for the fire we've lit." Olivia Price's eyes softened, Then burn bright, Jack Miller. Burn bright, thought he. News articles lit up Jack Miller's phone. Dropout startup gains momentum. Won't I? Jack Miller whispered. They finally see us. Sarah Lopez clapped him on the back. I told you the world would listen. Tom Wilson grinned quietly, handing Jack a freshly bolted prototype. Robert Hayes said, This is your crucible, Jack. Don't lose yourself in the fire. Jack Miller said, The fire made me. Emma Johnson sent a text. I'm proud of you, Jack. His eyes watered as he whispered, It wasn't for pride, it was survival. Sarah Lopez said softly, Now it's legacy. Jack Miller smiled faintly. Legacy begins here. Daniel Reed stared at headlines in his glass office, anger flashing. Daniel Reed growled, A dropout is stealing my stage. Michael Carter said, He's reckless, he'll burn out. Daniel Reed slammed his desk, then make sure he does. Meanwhile, Jack Miller whispered to Sarah Lopez in the warehouse, He knows we're coming. Sarah Lopez said, Then we don't stop running. Tom Wilson muttered, Then let's build faster. Jack Miller clenched fists. He can't buy persistence. Robert Hayes whispered, Remember, Jack, empires crumble from within. Jack Miller nodded. Then we'll outlast him. At sunset, Jack Miller stood outside the warehouse, golden sky blazing behind him. Jack Miller whispered, This is no longer about me. It's about everyone who's been told they'll never make it. Sarah Lopez said, And you're proving them wrong. Tom Wilson added softly, We all are. Robert Hayes said, The world is watching now. Every choice matters. Jack Miller clenched his fists, then let them watch as we rise. Sarah Lopez placed her hand on his, whispering, Together. Jack Miller looked up at the burning horizon, voice steady, Then let Act 2 of our story begin. Jack Miller walked into a crowded auditorium filled with press cameras and flashing lights. Jack Miller whispered, This is the moment. Sarah Lopez squeezed his arm, saying, They'll hear you now. Olivia Price waited at the front row, arms crossed but faintly smiling. Daniel Reed entered through side doors, face tight with rage. Jack Miller stepped to the podium, heart pounding. They called me a dropout, a failure, a dreamer too stubborn to quit. Silence fell heavy. Jack Miller raised his voice, But this company stands as proof that scars can become strength. Cameras flashed brighter as the crowd leaned in. Jack Miller continued, voice steady and unshakable. Jack Miller said, I built this company with rejection emails, betrayal scars, and nights the world told me to quit. Sarah Lopez whispered from backstage, Tell them, Jack, you'll. Jack Miller's voice rose. Every step here was fueled by doubt. But doubt is the spark of resilience. Olivia Price nodded slowly, her eyes lighting up. Daniel Reed muttered from shadows, He's stealing my stage. Jack Miller slammed his hand on podium. This isn't just my story. It's every story of those told they'd never succeed. Applause erupted like thunder. Backstage after the speech, Jack Miller leaned against the wall, trembling. Sarah Lopez said, You did it, Jack. You lit the fire. Jack Miller whispered, I felt every scar reopen, but I turned them into fuel. Tom Wilson entered with toolbox still in hand, saying softly, We've already won, Jack. Robert Hayes approached, smiling. The boy I mentored is now the man who leads. Jack Miller said, I couldn't have done this without all of you. Emma Johnson's text buzzed. I believe in you now. Jack Miller exhaled, whispering, Finally, they all see me. Sarah Lopez answered, We always did. Later that night, Jack Miller stood on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. Jack Miller whispered, This is where the storm ends and the sunrise begins. Sarah Lopez stood beside him, arms crossed, smiling. You're not the dropout anymore. Jack Miller said, No, I'm the storm that never quit. Robert Hayes approached quietly, saying, Storms fade, Jack. Leaders last. Jack Miller nodded, whispering, Then I'll be both. Tom Wilson leaned against railing, murmuring, We built this together. Jack Miller smiled faintly, and together, we'll build more. The city lights reflected in his determined eyes. At dawn, Jack Miller walked through empty warehouse, golden light filling the space. Jack Miller whispered, "This place was once ruins. Now it's the foundation of everything." Sarah Lopez appeared behind him saying, "And it will keep growing." Jack Miller turned, smiling softly, "Not because of me but because of us." Robert Hayes entered, whispering, "And because you never quit." Tom Wilson followed, toolbox in hand, quiet loyalty in his steps. Jack Miller stood tall in the morning light, voice steady, "This is just the beginning. The world hasn't seen anything yet." The warehouse roared silently with promise.